think only the monsters live. Only the monsters. Only the most psycho of psychos. Only the most evil dog-eat-dog people.
If you see another person that looks identical to you, run away and hide.
Throughout time, some brothers and sisters have taken their bond to a dark level, committing shocking crimes and leaving a trail of terror in their wake. From cases like the Menendez brothers that shocked the world, to disturbing crimes carried out by siblings you've probably never heard of, these are evil siblings in history you pray you never encounter. The Menendez brothers case is one of the most infamous crime cases of the 90s, and it's easy to see why. It's incredibly shocking and disturbing. It was receiving all this media attention at the time as one of the most notorious trials of the decade. Then the O.J. Simpson case came around and the Menendez brothers kind of faded out of the public eye. For those who are unfamiliar though, Lyle and Erik Menendez had a pretty privileged upbringing in Beverly Hills, but then they killed their parents. Of course, they denied this, saying that armed robbers were responsible, but authorities soon started getting suspicious of them after they started noticing all the fancy stuff the brothers were buying with their inheritance money they received from their late parents, which was quite sizable. Eventually, they confessed to having killed their parents, saying they'd wanted to escape their father's overly controlling behavior and high standards. In court, the defense argued that the brothers had suffered horrible mistreatment at the hands of their parents. The prosecution argued that this was pure fabrication and that they'd taken their parents' lives in order to receive their father's multi-million-dollar estate. It took 2 trials before the brothers were finally put to justice, receiving life imprisonment for their crimes. What you're seeing here is an interview with the Kray Twins, 2 of England's most notorious criminals. You know, you're famous when Tom Hardy plays you in a biopic. But yeah, this is an actual interview with the gangsters just 2 years before they were incarcerated. Ronnie and Reggie Kray were notorious gangsters in London during the 50s and 60s. They ran a violent group known as The Firm, which operated in the East End of London. At the time, they were also successful nightclub owners, hosting celebrities like Judy Garland and Frank Sinatra. The Krays earned the nickname Britain's Godfathers, being involved in various criminal activities, including extortion, armed robbery, arson, hijacking, you name it. They were known for their brutal tactics and worked together seamlessly, almost like they could read each other's minds during fights. In 1968, police finally arrested them for the killings of Jack the Hat McVitie and George Cornell. After their conviction, both brothers were sent to prison. Ronnie died from a heart attack in 1995, while Reggie passed away from cancer in 2000. In the early hours of June 30th, 2014 in Fresno, California, twin brothers Gerald and Jared Smith approached a 35-year-old woman. After asking her for money, she said she didn't have any, so they began ruthlessly attacking her. Then a 49-year-old homeless passerby named Nathan Halstead pulled over on his bike and tried to intervene. Instead of stopping, the twins just turned their aggression towards him. For several minutes, they attacked Halstead, leaving him unconscious on the ground. Then a driver approached the scene and attempted to help Halstead. In response, the Smith twins then targeted this driver as well, and amid all this chaos, a third vehicle came along, swerving to avoid Halstead's bike, but unfortunately ended up hitting Halstead, who was lying in the lane. The twins then fled the scene. The investigation led to the collection of fingerprints from a vehicle, which revealed that Gerald Smith had touched the hood during the altercation. Both twins were arrested shortly thereafter. They were convicted in 2019, but could potentially be released as early as 2026. On April 1st of 1990, the quiet town of South Dakota was shaken when an 85-year-old Walter Gibbs was found dead in his home. Now, at first it was thought he died of natural causes, but about a year later, authorities received a tip that turned the case on its head. Darlene Phillips, a 46-year-old woman serving time in prison, was reportedly bragging about having killed Gibbs, and this was not out of the realm of possibility. Darlene had a history with Gibbs. They'd been married and divorced twice, and just months before his death, She'd, tried to set his house on fire, so it wasn't like she was just bragging for the sake of it. Police would exhume Gibbs' body, and on closer inspection it looked like he had been killed. But Darlene's then husband, Jerome Phillips, eventually confessed to the crime. He said that he smothered Gibbs with a pillow while Darlene held down his legs, all while Darlene's twin sister, Delores Christensen, was hanging out in the next room, knowing full well what was going on. And why was she cool with it? Well, it turned out Delores was the beneficiary of Gibbs' will. Both sisters had actually been married to Gibbs at one point or another and had divorced him more than once, which is really weird. Imagine divorcing someone and then marrying an identical version of them. I mean, wouldn't you just want something new? And then doing it like twice over, too. Very bizarre case. Anyway. On September 29th of 2001 in Penrose, Colorado, 24-year-old Joel Stovall was arrested for killing his neighbor's dog. Sheriff's Deputy Jason Schwartz responded to the call and placed Joel in the back of his police car. Joel's twin brother, Michael, was also arrested after making threats. Unfortunately, Michael had not been properly searched before being placed in the cruiser, and as they drove toward the police station, Michael freed himself with a pair of handcuff keys that he'd hidden in his pocket, pulled out a firearm, and shot at Deputy Schwartz. The twins fled to a nearby town where they had a rented trailer loaded with weapons and ammo. 2 police officers arrived at the trailer, and then the twins started opening fire on the officers. One officer was left paralyzed after the confrontation. The brothers then stole a truck and led police on this high-speed chase. They kept firing at the pursuing officers while throwing stuff out of the back of the truck to slow them down. Eventually, the Stovall brothers ran over road spikes and encountered a police roadblock, but that still wasn't enough to stop them. They managed to escape into the nearby mountains. A massive manhunt was launched, but one day later, the twins ended up turning themselves in. 1 police officer was dead now, 18 others were injured. They were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. On the evening of August 17, 1993, a police officer in Salem, Oregon responded to a wellness call after an elderly couple, Richard and Grace Remy, hadn't answered their door. The officer entered the home to find both Richard and Grace dead. Shortly after, 2 young twins named Lydell and Laycelle White were arrested. Living nearby, they had a history of criminal behavior that included harassment, burglary, and SA. First, they were sentenced to life without the possibility of parole, but because of their young age, the punishment was later deemed cruel and unusual, and they can apply for parole as early as 2048. On May 22nd of 1998, a man named Jack Wilson returned to his home in Huntsville, Alabama to find an intruder waiting for him. The intruder brutally attacked him with a baseball bat before jabbing him with a blade. A week later, a carpenter named James White was arrested and charged in connection with Jack's death. Shortly after, both Jack's wife, Betty Wilson, and her twin sister, Peggy Lowe, were also arrested. As the investigation unfolded, the attacker, James White, confessed that he was having an affair with Peggy, who was already married. Although Peggy didn't want anything to happen to her husband, she did tell James that her sister Betty was married to Jack Wilson and had apparently wanted something bad to happen to him so that he'd be out of the way. According to White, he was hired to handle the problem that was Jack, and claimed he was promised $2,500 up front and an additional $2,500 after the act was carried out. Both Betty and White were convicted and received life sentences. Peggy maintained her innocence though, and argued that White was mentally unstable and that she hadn't even been having an affair with him. The Spahalski twins just could not stay out of trouble to save their lives. There's almost nothing these two didn't do. Stephen and Robert Spahalski grew up doing crimes together. By the time they were 18, they were doing armed robberies. One of these robberies went wrong, and Stephen ended up killing the store owner. He was sentenced to life in prison. But Robert's life didn't get any better now that he didn't have his partner in crime. In fact, it got way worse. He got into several illicit substances and started working in what's referred to as the oldest profession. Google that if you need to. Starting in 1973, he'd be in and out of prison for all sorts of things. And then starting in 1990, things got really bad. He killed a woman named Maureen Armstrong, a fellow worker of the night. A few months after that, he strangled his girlfriend. Then in 1991, he took the life of one of his male clients. It wasn't until 2005 that he'd kill again though, when he beat his girlfriend's neighbor to death after hallucinating that she'd turned into a demon. Obviously, he was not sober at the time. After sobering up though, he turned himself in, also confessing to the other killings years before. He received a 100-year prison sentence. The Carr brothers, Reginald and Jonathan, were responsible for a horrific crime spree in Wichita, Kansas in December of 2000. Over 6 days, they committed a series of violent acts that shocked the community. It all began on December 8th when they robbed a 23-year-old assistant baseball coach. This was just the start of the rampage though. 3 days later, on December 11th, the brothers escalated their crimes by fatally wounding a 55-year-old cellist during a carjacking. Their most disturbing act occurred on December 14th, though, when they broke into a home where 5 young adults were gathered. After robbing the house of valuables, they subjected the victims to horrific torment. The brothers forced them to withdraw money from ATMs, draining their bank accounts, and after that, they took the lives of the 5 victims at a secluded soccer complex on the outskirts of Wichita. Amazingly though, one of these victims, Holly G, managed to survive and later identified the brothers. The Carrs had fired at the back of their victims' heads, but a plastic hair clip Holly had been wearing deflected the bullet and she survived. The Carr brothers were caught and are now on death row at the El Dorado Correctional Facility. In 2008, an argument between 2 brothers over inheritance money turned deadly. 50-year-old David P. Hett was found dead in his home in South Carolina by his friend. He'd received blunt force trauma to the head. He also had several defensive wounds on his arms and hands. Turned out his attacker had been his very own brother, Paul Richard Hett. Turned out they'd gotten into a heated argument over inheritance money, which quickly turned violent. Their mother had just died, leaving Paul with pretty much all her assets, and David just received $1. Ouch, I can see why an argument may have started there. With all that said though, I've been your host James, and I'll catch you, yes you specifically, in the next video.